Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Housed, the Shared Living Podcast. My name is Dan Smith from Student Housing Consultancy.
And I'm Deenie from the Property Marketing Strategists.
And I'm Sarah from the Property Marketing Strategists.
And we have plenty of topics to cover today in terms of what we're looking at, what we're working on, and the big news across the shared living sector, covering student, BTR, co-living, later living, and any other areas of shared living. So yeah, why don't we start with what's new and currently exciting? Sarah, what have you been seeing?
Been quite busy, I think, in the news, particularly, I guess, around the sort of the student demographic, really, who obviously contribute to a lot of the shared living demographic, really. So I think one thing that we've seen this week is sort of front headline news about kind of what's going on behind the scenes with recruiting international students. I know, Dan, that you've kind of focused quite a lot on this, and it seems to me that it's been misreported. That's kind of my understanding of it, and lots of people have come out and kind of criticised the Times for their kind of shoddy journalism on this. Is that right, Dan?
That's exactly right. It was shoddy journalism, and I think one of the main issues is that the whole premise behind the story was that there's been a bit of a concern that international students have a backdoor into degrees, undergraduate degrees, via various different sort of avenues ultimately, and that the grade boundaries effectively are being lowered for international students. Where the problem sort of lies is that there was no real differentiation between the two sort of pathways, one of which is the sort of foundation course that university students, international students can take, which gets their qualifications up to a similar level to the sort of A-level equivalent in the UK and helps them with language skills and general academic skills. And they're really valid. It's the likes of Kaplan and Into and various others. And actually universities offer these foundation courses direct themselves too. And those were confused with the likes of the International Year One, which I'll be honest, I didn't really know a huge amount about. But International Year One effectively is where an international student will go through a pathway provider, again, like a Kaplan or an Into, and they will then go through that first year straight onto the second year of a specific undergraduate course. Now, that first year, the International Year One, will cover certain areas of that course, really getting their academic sort of skills up to scratch and also some of their language skills. But that is definitely seen as a bit of a backdoor by the industry. And I think that it was that the Times were really sort of shouting about, or should have been shouting about, rather than the foundation courses, which seem, genuinely more valid. But overall, and having looked at some of these international year one courses, most of them are for tier two universities, not really as much for the Russell Group unis. But there are definitely lower grade boundaries for international students compared to domestic students on these international year one courses. Now, the uproar is obviously around the fact that internationals therefore have precedence supposedly over domestics. Well, yes, they do in a certain extent, because universities, there's a huge funding crisis. They need international students to get onto their courses. But in the grand scheme of things, and the bigger picture is that actually international students are propping up the domestic students and that cohort, because universities make a £2,000 a year loss on a domestic student compared to an international student. So if you don't have international students coming in, then you've got a real problem. And I think a lot of these universities that have been pushing the international year one courses, they're the universities that have either been not struggling financially necessarily, but really focusing on an international recruitment drive. So I would expect, with the government as they are at the moment, for them to come down quite hard on these international year one courses if they can understand the difference between the foundation courses and those international year ones. So that was the sort of it was front page of the Sunday Times. I got a lot of messages on Sunday about that. But yeah, I think it's not necessarily a storm in a teacup. I do think there's valid arguments against international year one courses, but equally, I think there are, valid arguments for them too. It's just a case of how low do you drop your grade boundaries and how open are you about that? We've seen York University say that they will drop their grade boundaries for international students compared to domestic. So I would expect that to continue.
And like you say, Dan, it's so much about funding, isn't it? It's all being driven by money. And if you want to keep your university going, you've got to find the funding, and that's the way to find it. And it's all part of the wider ecosystem and the problem, which, as we've discussed before, is probably not going to change until we see new government coming in. And even then, will we see it? Who knows?
Yes, we wait with bated breath for a new government, but who knows what will happen between now and the next election. So I do think that we just need to make sure that we're battening down the hatches. There's a lot of doom and gloom in the higher education sector at the moment, and that is being precipitated by, a really hardline immigration sort of focus from the government, based on the fact that they feel they can probably win the next election on immigration. So it's going to be really interesting to see, but the context of the university funding crisis is a really worrying one for sure.
We'll keep an eye on that one. Like you said, it's not over yet, and there's lots of things that can change in between.
What else have we been seeing in the news at the moment?
Well, I saw that you have been talking about kind of the ongoing, I guess, decrease of Chinese students. Just it might be interesting for viewers just to have a kind of hear about what you're hearing there.
Yes, it came from Jason Yin. If you deal with Chinese students, you'll know Jason. He is the founder of U Homes, the largest international student accommodation marketplace, sending originally Chinese students into the UK, but more recently taking a bit more of a global approach. And he effectively raised a red flag, saying that he thought February was going to be anywhere between 8 to 20% down year on year for Chinese student numbers. He did then follow it up, or UHomes did then follow it up with a promotional email offering effectively joint promotions, but these weren't paid promotions, so I don't think it was like a false flag to drive any revenue. The cynic in me maybe thought that first of all, but having spoken to quite a lot of operators since my post, I don't think that's the case. Jason's a really good sort of benchmark of what's going on. He is the canary in the coal mine, as it were, fully understands the Chinese market, what drives them, where they're going. He's got the latest data and, brings the largest number of Chinese students into the UK. So he's got his ear to the ground on that for sure. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether or not that sort of comes to fruition. But there's a few operators out there that are saying we're slightly concerned about China and the Chinese numbers, but I don't think there's any major cause for panic at the minute.
It's affordability a factor, because there is this myth in the market that Chinese students are super rich, they can afford super high tuition fees and they'll, always rent the premium accommodation, which, to be honest, has driven a lot of the PBSA market over the last kind of 15 years, really. And I think we've seen the product develop in line with potentially those myths. So is it a myth that they're super wealthy and can afford any level of rent at any cost?
There is no doubt that the Chinese students do pay a premium for their accommodation. They typically like, or have liked in the past, a good studio product, and that's suited investors in particular and developers down to the ground, because numbers of Chinese students have been so high that's kind of who we've built for, especially when we've had really studio heavy developments. It's an interesting one as to how much this comes down to affordability, but realistically Chinese students are now very varied in that, yes, you have the sort of premium 0.1%ers, but you also then have the families that have saved for decades to send the prodigal son or daughter to university to then hopefully come back and get a great job. I do think there's a bit of a concern about the high level of unemployment in China, and that if you come across to the UK, then, and I'm hearing this from agents and marketplaces, if you then come across to the UK, you kind of lose touch with that career path within China, and you're seen as a little bit of an outsider to a certain extent. I think that goes against the way that the international student pathway from China has been seen previously, where it was, you go abroad, you go to a really credible university, and then you come back and bring your skills and your knowledge and your qualifications back to China. I think China's spent a lot of money on PBSA in particular. I think they built about 2 million beds during lockdown, in a couple of years, and their universities are creeping up the global rankings. So it could be that this is a bit more of a long-term trend that we see. We've seen the numbers drop off over the course of the last few years compared to what it's been. Now it's about, what is that long-term trend going to look like? Have we now got a lot of stock that could become stranded? And by stock, I mean PBSA beds that could become stranded because not everyone wants the same sort of price or room type as a Chinese student. So it's going to be an interesting one to see for sure.
I'm sure it will be something that we're going to come back to again and again and see what those trends are and see, how those international students change, I guess, over the next few years and what happens there. Moving on to kind of a different topic, what we're seeing in the way of kind of refurbishing, retrofitting. There's a lot of talk about development and there's a lot of older buildings. We talk in PBSA about the first generation stock. What is going to happen with stock? How are we going to retrofit it? How are we going to make it more sustainable? And how are we also going to hit the affordability button whilst doing all that?
I think one thing that I spoke about on a panel on a Unite podcast a while ago was we talk about kind of sustainable buildings in the kind of, I guess, the building material and probably, kind of scope 2 and 3. But actually, when we talk about sustainability, it's kind of what's the longevity of that building as well. And certainly refurbishing is part of that, is bringing new life into a building that would otherwise be derelict. And, we are starting to see that with kind of some of the conversions of kind of department stores and offices. But actually, one really interesting point that was brought up in this podcast is there might be kind of, some wobbles ahead for PBSA, for example. So how could buildings that are built for one purpose be changed into another purpose to keep the longevity going? So, for example, like if you build 3 and 4 bedroom apartments and your student market drops out of that city, it's a real prime opportunity to turn it into family flats. And you can do that with a 3-4 bedroom or sharers. You can't do that very easily with 6, 8, 10 bedroom apartments. And it then becomes, really, really ineffective, particularly from a cost and an ESG point of view, to kind of then be chopping and changing and, moving bathrooms around and moving walls around and, fire safety indoors, etc. So I think that's one element of kind of that we've got to bear in mind when we talk about kind of sustainability is the long-term purpose, really.
I'd love to see a lot more refurbishment. I mean, there's no more sustainable building than the building that's already been built. So from a sustainability perspective, it's great that, some investors, developers are looking at this. And, Study In, they were famous for taking a grey building, an office block, and turning it into PBSA. It's a model that has worked really well for them in the past. I think there's a bit more of a focus on development now, but I'm sure that they'll be looking at pretty much any opportunity for refurbishment as well, given how good they were at doing that previously. And the likes of Richard at Keckskill as well. He's literally developing or refurbing an office block in Nottingham into PBSA. I'd just like to see a lot more of that. The margins are still there. The development margins are still there in refurbs. And so I think that there is a huge opportunity when you look at department stores and anything in a city centre, where a lot of city and town centres are, they're ghost towns in a lot of places. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring the students into those areas and kind of regenerate and create a bit more of a vibrant student scene in a town or city centre where it's typically not as residential, and therefore you're not sort of displacing local residents. So I do think that is a huge opportunity that not that many investors are particularly interested in, because yes, the margins are much better in development from scratch, from the ground up, but I think it's one way of really solving the student housing crisis in terms of the number of beds that we have available. And those locations are typically fairly central when you look at, decent offices and sort of the old department stores, etc.
How kind of costly is it to bring those up to standards in terms of sustainability, making them green buildings?
Yeah, good question. I mean, case by case basis, of course, but yeah, you've got so many different measures that you'll need to put in place. A lot of the old heating systems within these offices just wouldn't be remotely suitable for anything residential, and the same for sort of retail, etc. too. So, the first thing you've got to go in and look at is ripping out an entire heating, water, the electrics, etc., and just starting from scratch. So I think it does away with a lot of the more complex planning that you have when you're starting from scratch. So there's a lot of fees that are saved there, but it's it's still very labor intensive when it comes to the overall sort of structure and the schematics of the building.
What I really love about refurbished buildings is that they're creative. You have to be more imaginative with space. And I think that's one thing that, as developers, architects, investors kind of need to get your head around. You're not going to reproduce your kind of 6 to 8 bedroom cluster flat model off a corridor. I did some market research recently around the Midlands, and I saw a couple of really, really great examples, and they were quirky and every room was different. And yes, it makes it difficult to kind of price, but there were these little nooks and crannies that had been converted into, breakout spaces and different social spaces that, traditionally in a new build you would see on the ground floor. But actually it made it really interesting. And, for me, I feel like potentially for a resident living in a building like that, it makes it more memorable. You'd look back in 20, 30, 40 years time and you'd remember living in that building because of its quirks. So I think it's kind of reimagining, I guess, what we know from the classic kind of, BTR and PBSA building, really, that there can be, a different way. And I guess, the overall, I guess maybe the benefit, like you said, it's not necessarily financial. You're not going to save money by refurbishing a building, but if you're serious about ESG and, particularly, like you said, breathing life into new places, it's about community building, and it's, you're saving that embodied carbon by not destroying an old building, and the disruption you can imagine to a city centre by building new. You definitely get more of the local people on side by, like I said, breathing new life into an old building. No one wants a derelict building, in their eyesight.
Grayson's Properties are just in the process of taking over Jopling House in Sunderland, which is the old Debenhams, and that's been turned into PBSA effectively. It's kind of a PBSA co-living mix, but it's fascinating seeing how, seeing the potential. And you're right, the quirkiness of those spaces. They're really sort of really unique, absolutely gigantic rooms. So, the use of space, if you were designing from scratch, there's no way you'd build it like that. But at the same time, building with what you've got or working with what you've got, I think that's really important for the sector. And it's also a quick win as well. Refurb takes so much, it's typically a lot quicker than building from the ground up in terms of, from, as I said before, your planning and everything beyond that. So I do think that it's a really quick way to solve the student housing crisis, well, at least alleviate to a certain extent the student housing crisis for sure.
It also breathes some fresh life, as you say, into our cities, and so many of our kind of town centres and cities are kind of have lost a lot, and they've lost so much retail, they've lost so much life, and it kind of feels that, like we've said before, it's like working with the local authority, working with the university. This is a solution that hits lots of boxes and really should be encouraged. Whether we'll see that or not, who
and what it means for the affordability as well. I think that's one of the key things. Yes, it is typically cheaper, but in terms of the development of refurb and the refurbs compared to a development from the ground up, but whether that will translate into more affordable rents, that remains to be seen.
I think my view on that is, again, it comes down to imagination with that space. It might not be suitable in a refurb to create en suites in every bedroom. You might not have that kind of plumbing going on. So actually, can you create smaller units with shared bathrooms? We're doing quite a bit of research at the moment into shared rooms as well. So like you said, it might be because of window placement, you might end up with some like massive rooms, but they could be potentially shared rooms. So I think, there are opportunities, if you think outside the box, to create a more affordable product, because you can do something new. You're not then kind of competing, from a price point of view with the standard kind of 13 square meter ensuite room or the 18 to 20 square meter studio. But yeah, I'm a massive architecture geek, and seeing kind of old buildings and all the character in them, I'm absolutely fascinated with this one.
And the opportunities are out there because, Christ, office spaces are really having a tough time at the moment. And so I think the opportunities are out there to repurpose a lot of these buildings. And if it's residential, typically councils are crying out for it. So the more that we can push that, the better. Will we see specific developers or operators or investors looking only to go for refurbs? I doubt it, but I'd like to think that rather than taking the sort of well-trodden path of, right, we get the planning, we build it from scratch, we run it, I'd like to see people being a bit more opportunistic about some of the opportunities that are out there.
Is the planning easier or harder?
It's easier, typically.
Right. So that's another plus for it, really.
It would be, yeah. I mean, obviously, again, it depends on the council. It's very different from Newcastle to Camden to Southampton, etc.
I think one caveat health factor that, you know, that we need to consider that I don't think any of us would want to see, which we have seen a little bit of, is those older kind of first generation cheap buildings that they've been, you know, refurbished within an inch of their life, and suddenly they're the newest, swankiest, you know, most beautiful accommodation in the city. And, you know, whilst, you know, that's great from a marketing point of view, you know, you get to show off a sparkly new building, but it's actually, there's a real danger of taking out that bottom tier of PBSA in a city that is affordable for residents. You know, and as the years go by, we might start seeing this in, you know, in BTR and co-living as well. It's like, you know, a building should be quality, good quality, and run well, but that doesn't mean it needs to be the shiniest and have the most amazing facilities. Can actually, you know, retrofit. A lot of people, I guess, will be prioritizing fire safety and ESG with these older buildings, absolutely, but they don't have to be completely gutted and ripped out and then the rent massively increased in order to do that.
The impact of the new sort of fire safety regs and building safety regs, that's definitely going to have an impact on, you know, what developers are looking for. And I think about the old fire station that you obviously dealt with, Sarah, and that's, you know, a great example of retrofitting into you know, not necessarily a derelict building, but one that was ultimately repurposed, and I know that did extremely well.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, it goes back to the whole HMO example. You know, I lived in an old Victorian building when I was a student, and it just gets repainted and you put a new bathroom and kitchen in when it needs it. It doesn't need to have all the bells and whistles. It just needs to look clean and tidy. And I was fortunate enough that I did live and it wasn't damp, it wasn't leaking. I know some people had worse experiences in their HMO back in the day when we were studying. But yeah, you don't need to refurb to the hilt. It's just keeping it clean, tidy, simple, nice to live in.
So if we can all be aware of the opportunities and be as opportunistic as possible from a development to an investor standpoint, and also for operators to be sort of proactively thinking, right, okay, well, there's a building there, like if I can take that to a developer or an investor, there's a real opportunity there to turn that into student accommodation. The opportunities are definitely out there. I see them every day walking down the street. I'm sure everyone else does too. It's just about time we made all of this real estate work for us, whether it's student accommodation, co-living, BTR, etc. You know, as I said before, there's no more sustainable building than the one that's already been built. So hopefully there's more opportunities to come. So the next topic is one very close to my heart, and it's about lobbying. Now, lobbying can come in various different forms, but do we think ultimately that there is a need for more lobbying within student accommodation, also I suppose within co-living and BTR, etc., given there's a housing crisis across the board? But yeah, what are we thinking about student accommodation and the way that we're lobbying at the moment?
I think we're overwhelmingly yes. I think we do need more of our voices being heard. And I know there's lots of people doing it. I know, Dan, you've done your bit of trying to get that voice heard, and I'm, you know, Unite are working on this, and Unipol, and there's lots of people doing their thing, but it feels very much I've been in the sector for years, but it feels very much that it's not loud enough, it's not collaborative enough, it's not actually bringing everyone's thoughts and voices together to really drive that change that we need. I think it's something that we all feel really strongly about. And I think one of the things that Sarah and I are always talking about, and something that in our travels to Europe we see, is that in Europe, our sector sees themselves very much as part of the housing crisis, and we don't talk like that in the UK. And I feel that if we did think like that more actively and actually had that lobbying voice and went to the government with that, and we're all part of the solution. And actually we need to realise that, and actually realise the power of that and the influence of that. And I just feel that working together more collectively, more louder and more collaboratively would have a great impact, not only on our influence on governments in the sector, but also just on the actual housing situation we find ourselves in across the board.
I mean, Deanie, you talk about being collaborative as part of the housing sector, but I think the other missing piece specifically is the education sector. And that, so it's a three-way prong, really, isn't it? It's like, you know, we've got PBSA here, and we've got the housing crisis. But imagine a triangle, and we've got education, and we've got housing, and we've got PBSA, and they're all part of the same loop. So I know that there's amazing voices in education from a kind of, a lobbying, and, there are ministers about education, there are ministers for universities. So, that's kind of being done. But like, what if we don't have good quality accommodation and enough of it in the right places for the right people, then that education piece will be missing, and then the housing piece is, well, actually, creating homes for people. It don't know that there should be such a distinction between students as some kind of other part population. They are people that need housing, and I've never ever heard it being discussed by any housing minister ever.
I've been quite vocal about this. It's such a frustration trying to coordinate or get any answers out of the government or have any sort of impact. But I think I'd been frustrated by what I'd perceived as a bit of a lack of action on behalf of students, universities, etc. And so I kind of took it into my own hands to just reach out to my local MPs. There's no secret to how you lobby. You effectively just contact as many people as you can, and see who can then get you into the right door, in through the right door. And so I've met with housing policymakers in government. I've met with the shadow housing department as well. There's no coordination across the board with higher education, housing, etc., and any other areas. And I think one of my goals eventually is to help to create a national student housing strategy that can be rolled out across each local city or town or whatever it might be, that would coordinate the university, the private sector, most importantly the planning department, albeit that needs complete root and branch reform to make it more amenable to creating the kind of developments that are needed across housing in general, not just student accommodation, co-living or BTR. So I think being on these calls and meeting these people, I could just see that there was a huge amount of frustration that they didn't feel like they could coordinate the other departments. What was really clear when I met the government housing policymakers was that the Home Office were ruling the roost at the time Suella Braverman was in. And it was very much, there was a lot of eye rolling when it came to thinking about, immigration targets and international students and where they were going to live, etc. But there was definitely a willingness to listen and engage. It also fed into some of the renters reform bill, with them wanting to understand what that would mean for students in particular. And again, I just don't feel like the HMO sector's really been listened to. And I think it will end up being pretty catastrophic for the student HMO sector, for the sort of individual landlords. There'll be some landlords that, and I think the slightly larger landlords will do quite well, albeit, there may be some increases in prices, etc. But yeah, ultimately, the lobbying that I've seen from the likes of Universities UK and Unipol in the past maybe hasn't produced the results that we've wanted. But I think that part of that is that, the government just haven't listened. This is a government that does what it wants. And typically at the moment, from what I've seen, governs by headlines. You just look at what Robert Harford, the higher education minister, came out after that article on in the Sunday Times, on the front of the Sunday Times, saying, we're going to sort it. We've got this. We're getting to work. Well, you already knew this was going on. Just because it's in the paper doesn't mean that you should then action it. You should be proactively looking at what the opportunities are to improve the higher education sector anyway. So I'd like to think that after the next election, a new government, if that happens, from a personal standpoint, fingers crossed that does happen, that there will be, again, just a complete look at how we can interact as a sector with the government, both in student accommodation, the housing sector as a whole, and really drive meaningful change. I think it's looking at Unipol with Paddy Jackman going in as CEO. I think that will start to shake things up a bit. Paddy's well known for saying what he thinks, and I think that's really, really important in that kind of role where he's representing the PBSA sector as a whole. And it's not that we've been missing that representation, it's that I think Unipol has had various different areas that they've focused on. But I think with Paddy kind of galvanising the sector's voice, that will certainly help us get to the heart of government at some point.
No, that's great. And let's watch this space. And I know it's something that we're all passionate about seeing changing. And I guess if anyone wants to come and talk to us about any of that, then please do, because I think it is so desperately needed and and as you say, have great impact, not just on the housing crisis, but actually what we can actually build and move that innovation forward and solve some of those barriers that we've got to actually create more affordable buildings because of the challenges that are faced in planning. So it's a really important thing.
This ended up being a really political episode, didn't it? I don't think we intended that at the beginning, but we've gone that way. So we'll try and bring some lighter topics to future episodes.
Sarah, what was the Recharge 24 event like in Belfast that you've been to recently?
So that was hosted by International Hospitality Media, and I was asked to be a speaker, and I kind of thought, is it the right audience? I'm not, massively involved in hospitality, but actually they were trying to bring together part of the rented property sector and try and be more collaborative. And it was really, really interesting. I loved hearing about some of the challenges, but also some of the progress that is being made in the hospitality industry. And also it was in Belfast, and I hadn't been to Belfast for a few years. It's a city I absolutely love, and hearing from some of the government people, some of the people from the Titanic Quarter about kind of their vision for the city was absolutely inspirational. They're actively trying to get people to live in the city centre. They've got a great setup for employment and jobs and industry, and particularly media and tech. And now they want people to actually live there. And that was so refreshing to hear. And there's also, really kind of, I guess, bringing back what we've been discussing today, a real focus on preserving those gorgeous Victorian buildings that they have in Belfast. And they've got a real focus on conservation and refurbishment as well. I talked about Gen Z and what they want from accommodation and kind of linked that to, anyone that's building hotels, co-living, BTR, needs to look at what the youngest generation are doing, because that will certainly influence their decisions. Also, just a quick mention to Room 2, which is where the event was hosted and where I stayed. And they talked a lot about kind of their ESG vision, and it's evident everywhere. I've never stayed in a hotel that felt like it had thought through the guest experience, but not at the expense of the environmental focus of their net being net zero. So yeah, it was a really, really interesting all-round experience. Recommend it as an event. Really great people, and we talk the three of us at a lot of events. Possibly one of the most engaged audiences that I've spoken in front of. There were lots of questions afterwards, lots of interest on the topic, and very open, welcoming audience. So yeah, thank you, International Hospitality Media, for including me.
Great, I think that wraps up the episode. So thanks ever so much for joining us. We are really keen to make sure that we look at the topics that you guys want us to look at. So do please, write in, send us a message, find us on LinkedIn, and we hope to see you next time. We'll catch you soon for episode 4.